This is Current Reflections, a production of Tribal College, Journal of American Indian Higher Education.
For this installment of Current Reflections, we are joined by longtime Tribal College professor and scholar Dr. Daniel Wildcat. I'm Bradley Shreve. A Yuchi member of the Muskogee Nation and a professor at Haskell Indian Nations University for 36 years, Dr. Wildcat is author of the landmark books Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge, and Power and Place, Indian Education in America, co-authored with Vine Deloria Jr. He has been one of the foremost thinkers on how the climate crisis affects Indigenous peoples and how traditional Indigenous knowledge holds the keys for many of the problems we face today. He is a founding leader of the Hiawatha Center for Justice, the Haskell Environmental Research Studies Center, and the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group. Thanks for joining us, Dr. Wildcat. We're honored to have you here to discuss our current theme, Native Ways of Knowing.
You bet. Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's begin with what may seem like a very simple question, but which can be difficult to articulate. How do Native ways of knowing differ from other worldviews?
Yes. Well, I think it's an excellent question, and I think let's just try to lay the groundwork for people to maybe want to explore more deeply this question, because it really does take us into the heart of some of the most important issues humankind needs to face today. So let's begin by comparing Native ways of knowing to the dominant Western worldview and its tradition of knowledge, because after all, it's the most consequential in the world today. So I would frame it this way. Compared to a Western worldview and way of knowing, Indigenous traditions are distinctly non-anthropocentric. They are deeply relational in character, and they extend personhood and personality to most features of the natural world, including plants, animals, land, water, etc. Therefore, it opens the door to a very different system of morality and ethics. And finally, it avoids the tensions and binary either-or thinking of the Western tradition, especially in what the dominant society constructs as often in either a clear dichotomy between physical and spiritual realities. The metaphysics of many Indigenous traditions concede the world we experience is both a physical and spiritual landscape or seascape, and the Western tradition still approaches the physical world we experience as largely devoid of spirit. And so I think the point I would emphasize is that when you start looking at Native ways of knowing, the term that many people would use is, well, it's a holistic approach. Well, what that really means, it's deeply relational. It's about trying to understand our relationships to the balance of life we are a part of in this creation. It's distinctly non-anthropocentric. It doesn't place man above or at the center of creation. It sees us really as a part of a very complex living system this Mother Earth has created, the biosphere. And like I said, I think in that respect, it really offers a new lens through which to look at some of the most pressing problems we're facing today. So I really encourage people to kind of explore that. Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, is a marvelous example of that. 20 years earlier, Oscar Coagli's book on Yupik worldviews and science goes into that. And I hope people will take a look at my new book, which will be forthcoming here this fall, Brad. It's called On indigenuity, learning the lessons of Mother Earth. So I think there's starting to be some great opportunities to understand this indigenous way of knowing, and then the worldviews that they produce.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to your new book. When will it come out?
I think the target date is early November, just in time for the holiday season.
Oh, great. Okay. So you've advocated that the arts may be the best way to understand traditional ecological knowledges and native ways of knowing. Can you elaborate and explain why this is so?
Yeah, and it's without going too far down a technical path and raising some pretty complicated issues. I'll give you kind of the simplest approach, and that would be that I was asked about 5 years ago now to prepare something for a conference that is sponsored by environmental writers, not just journalists, but people who are poets, people who write novels, but who place the environment very much at their center. And it got me to thinking about what was I going to talk to these literary artists, these word artists about, and explaining traditional ecological knowledges. And what it struck me as interesting, and so I wrote this paper, and now it's included in a marvelous book edited by Michelle Montgomery. I'm making the argument that if you kind of want to understand traditional ecological knowledges, one way to do that is to think about how artists work. And artists have to know their materials, they have to know their media, they have to know their medium, and they really develop a keen awareness and knowledge about that. That's very much that kind of, if you will, environment that a sculptor must work in, a painter must work in, that kind of deep appreciation for that environment and then what they want to make is really akin in many ways to traditional ecological knowledges. I'm arguing for the following reasons. First of all, it makes us realize, and this was one of my very explicit points in writing this, so many people think our knowledges are all about the past. And I wanted to make an argument to say that, no, these are living knowledges. The Earth is changing. The planet is changing. We are indigenous people are paying keen attention to this. They're seeing new things. They're seeing different things. So what do? Well, they take this experience they've had from the past, they put it in the context of the present, and they may use some of the insights of traditional ecological knowledge of the past to create new knowledges that help them address new problems they are facing in the environment where they live, much like an artist will create a new painting, a new sculpture, and something. And so the really point I was trying to make was that I think we do ourselves a great disservice if we start thinking of traditional ecological knowledges as all about the past, way back then. No, traditional ecological knowledges are now, the preferred term seems to be indigenous knowledges, are living knowledges. They are knowledges where creative thinking can occur. And I think what's interesting about kind of the approach I was trying to make was to get people to understand that, although we're facing very different conditions in many places on the planet today, some that people have never seen before, they are drawing on the past, this deep knowledge of what they have, and then taking this new situation, these new circumstances, and creating, solutions workable knowledge, applied knowledge to address these things that is still traditional and ecological in character and indigenous knowledge, because it's about the embodiment of that symbiotic relationship between a people and a place. And so, the point I wanted to drive home was kind of twofold. Primarily, think of how artists work and an appreciation for that. And in some ways, people who hold indigenous knowledge work the same way to find new solutions or applications of knowledges. And in that respect, it really helps us avoid, this thinking that, that's all about the past and the world's changing now, so it's no longer relevant, right? So some people would say, well, it doesn't matter. That may have been the way it was 100 years ago, but the world has changed. Well, you're exactly right. It has changed. And indigenous people are very mindful of those changes, and they are folding that information into the knowledge, the solutions, the practical applications they are going to create. So I thought maybe using artists and kind of the methodologies and environments they work in would be a good analogy to try to get people to not fall into that trap of thinking, indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledges are all about the past. No, they're very much about the present.
Yeah, and it's kind of refreshing to see that there's so much focus today on the STEM fields, and it's almost as if the arts and the humanities are devalued today.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to that this kind of dichotomous either or thinking. I think that we still find so dominant in the Western tradition. I do think that our TCUs have done a good job of trying to add, that A for arts to STEM and talk about STEAM, because I do think arts are a powerful form of communication, and that's something we should never forget. And it doesn't, in our traditions, I would argue that it would make no sense to try to contrast a potters, a weavers, an artist, representation of the world and what we're facing, to argue that somehow was counter to a deeply empirical and experiential understanding. It's just a different way of expressing it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think, that's something positive that I think in our TCUs we should really strive to embody, close that gap between art and science.
Yeah. What do you mean when you talk about technological homelessness?
Well, this is something that came out of our book. I think that was in Power and Place, if I'm not mistaken, and that I did with Vine Deloria. And this idea of technological homelessness I wanted to explore was the idea that so much is being written about this now. I mean, I think it's very, very relevant right now, because what are we finding out? We're finding out that some people, particularly young children and young teenagers, spend so much time on their technology that they're really not paying attention to where they are, to that situation, that place of where they are. They're always looking at these flat screen images of a reality that's maybe been completely fabricated, or maybe it's somewhere else on the other side of the world. And what I wanted to get to was that deep immersion into technology can really foster a sense in which people start to feel lost, homeless. And so it's a technologically induced homelessness. Maybe a better way to kind of approach it would be to say this. A lot of people who own homes are actually homeless. And what I mean by that is that they really don't pay a lot of attention to that place where they live. Maybe by the time they do that morning commute and evening commute, they're really only there 10 hours a day, Mm-hmm. And so my idea here was that the technology itself can be a factor in inducing this feeling of homelessness, of not really being, quote, we used to say in the 60s, grounded. Are you grounded? And I think we got a lot of people in our society who, quite frankly, aren't grounded. They're too busy looking on the flat screens and focusing on that. And this is what psychologists now are telling us is contributing to depression, suicide ideation, and I mean, just a whole range of very, disturbing trends among young people. And so again, I said, well, let's talk about technological homelessness. You may own a house, but do you really live and experience in that house as a home in a more, broader sense, a place, situated in a particular, landscape or environment. And I think, again, there's so much about modern societies. We camouflage that. We camouflage it by the kind of housing developments. We still invest in suburban housing developments where, we, cut down the trees that were once there to all build these nice uniform blocks. And of course, we plant trees, right? Right where they're, quote, supposed to be. And it's really a very artificial environment. And I think that's what contributes to some of this. So that's what I'm talking about, this sense of alienation or depression. I call it, well, they're experiencing a technological homelessness, even though maybe they have a house. They're not out on the streets, but they're not really deeply connected to that place in a way that maybe their ancestors were 2 or 3 generations ago, were to a place that they called home.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you touched on this. It does feel like we're dealing with a new set of problems today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which leads me into my next question. And that is, throughout history, people have thought that the end of times is near. Yet in January of 2023, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved their doomsday clock up to 90 seconds before midnight.
Mm-hmm.
Now, much of this was due to Russia's war on Ukraine and threats of using nuclear weapons, but they cited the environmental crisis as well.
Oh, yeah.
So, at any rate, it's the closest we've ever been to midnight. Do you think that we today have reason to be more concerned? And if so, why?
Yes, I do think we should all be deeply concerned. I think think of what, people have experienced over the last, 2 or 3 weeks now, across the northern part of the United States with these fires burning in Canada, these uncontrollable fires, uncontainable fires. I think, they said, what was it, 10 days ago when the wind was blowing that stuff towards Boston and New York City, I think there was a 48-hour period that New York City had the worst air quality of any city in the world for that 48-hour period. And I think these are wake-up calls. So just, all of my relatives, Yuchi relatives live down around Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Tulsa had, I think it was the same tornadic event that created that devastation in Texas. That front moved, north and east a little bit, and it didn't produce tornadoes, but they had straight winds of 100 miles an hour last Saturday night. And one of my former students, whom I'm working with on a large grant project now, lives there, and he texted me Sunday morning. He says, "Dr. Wildcat, I've never seen anything like this in a non-tornadic weather event. It wasn't a tornado. These were straight winds, and they just 100 miles an hour." And so I think, the kinds of fires we're having, the kinds of extreme weather events, and the heat waves that people are experiencing, I think this is our wake-up call. The climate change is here. And I think the question now is, are we going to take steps to try to mitigate, some of the consequences of what could happen if we do nothing? And so to me, it's like we're already going to face some really dire situations in places on this planet. I don't know if there will be any place that will be immune from some form of extreme weather event, some form of fire, or the other extreme, flooding. I think that this is our wake-up call. I think it's going to be real interesting in the next year to see how we respond. And of course, this is what drives my work. I believe right now, Brad, that the most important voices to listen to on the planet today are indigenous voices, the voices of indigenous peoples, because they understand what is going on. And I think if we listen and respectfully try to learn, they may hold the key to doing some things very differently in our societies, modern societies, that could help us mitigate some future harm that, if we do nothing, I think is going to be very, very devastating.
Dan Wildcat is author of Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge. We'll continue our discussion on Native ways of knowing in just a moment.
Yate, this is Marvin Tom, the advertising coordinator for the Tribal College Journal. Since 1989, TCJ has earned a loyal following of readers who are passionate about American Indian education. Our dynamic media outlet reaches a diverse, wide-ranging market, including students, educators, and lawmakers. And here's the best part: TCJ offers a variety of reasonable price advertising options that can be placed in our magazine, on our website, or right here in our Current Reflection podcast. For more information, contact me at 970-764-4238 or at marvin@tribalcollegejournal.org. Yeah.
This is Current Reflections, and I'm talking with Dan Wildcat, professor at Haskell Indian Nations University. In your contribution to the new book, Re-indigenizing Ecological Consciousness and the Interconnectedness to Indigenous Identities, You state that traditional ecological knowledges are an antidote to destruction. And you've kind of talked about this throughout, but can you elaborate a little bit more on this thesis?
Yeah, so I think that because of the deeply relational view that indigenous people hold, because they don't approach living in the world as if they are at the center of it, man, the measure of all things, or humankind, the measure of all things. I think, the big Earth system, historians tell us what? Well, we're now living in what they are terming the age of the Anthropocene, and that's the age of man. And I always tell people, think about that. I mean, really think about that. So in the last 200 years, maybe 300 years, we've moved into this age of the Anthropocene. Its human conduct is changing some of the fundamental systems, life systems of the planet, these relations that sort of drive weather, shape climate, determine, floods and droughts and all of those kinds of things. And I think if you look at that honestly, you have to say, well, so far, the age of this human-centered period of Earth history has not been very good for the balance of life on the planet. It's been deadly. It's been damaging to the biodiversity on the planet. It's been deadly to our forests. It's been deadly to, riparian ecosystems, river ecosystems, coastal estuaries. And I think that's all bound up in this dominant way of thinking. So I put forth in a very kind of short version, the antidote to destruction could be thought of this way. The modern Western worldview has constructed a world full of natural resources. I think we need to move away from that immediately and start saying, how would our conduct and behavior change if we recognize that we lived in a world full of natural relatives, and we attributed personhood and personality to plants and animals, as, by the way, my ancestors, my Zoyaha ancestors did, and most indigenous people do. Then we become a part of a much larger community that's naturally existed on the planet as opposed to an ideologically shaped nation state. So I'd say part of the antidote to destruction is we adopt indigenous ways of thinking about our relationship to the balance of creation by saying, hey, we don't live in a world full of resources. We live in a world full of relatives. And if we do that, Bradley, that gives us the opportunity then to say, okay, think of what that means then. That means then that if I live in a world full of relatives, I not only value my inalienable rights and liberties, but those rights and liberties are very shallow and hollow if they're not counterbalanced with inalienable responsibilities. And we have responsibilities when we live among relatives. You and I all know that. Any of us who are part of a human family, we know that being a respected part of that family, comes with responsibilities. You have responsibilities. So I think those two shifts could lead us from let's forget the world full of resources and adopt the worldview where we live among relatives. Let's counterbalance inalienable responsibilities with inalienable responsibilities we have to hold if we're members of these larger life system ecological communities and natural environments. And suddenly we no longer are going to be fighting about who has a right to this resource or that resource, but we're going to start framing the most important discussions we have is about how can I establish or be, as a lot of my students use this term, which I really love, right relations. What does it mean for humankind to finally put themselves in right relation with the balance of creation? And I think those ideas are the embodiment of the antidote to destruction. If we keep this extractive kind of view of, we're humans and we're in charge and we're going to make the system more efficient and we're going to use resources more wisely, I think we're just headed down a very destructive path. But if we change and say, okay, we live among relatives, and the relatives we live with, we have responsibilities, then I think we can start thinking about a resilience that helps us avoid some of the current greenwashing we see going on now with corporations. Every corporation has a sustainability plan. And the problem is, I always point out is, I'm not sure that I want to sustain what they want to sustain, So I think we could, following indigenous traditions, establish a way of thinking, okay, maybe in the place of an anthropocentric view of progress, maybe we need to replace that with a non-anthropocentric view. What we really want to do is live and make choices in such a way that we're promoting systems of life enhancement on this planet, not just capital gains, commodity consumption, and convenience for humans.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. So recently, as you probably read, tech leaders called for a moratorium on artificial intelligence, citing that it poses an existential risk to humanity, which I think a lot of people, that woke a lot of people up.
Right.
But how can native ways of knowing inform our conversations on the development of AI?
Well, so here's I'm still trying to wrap my mind around this, what this all means, like a lot of people. I will say this, I agree completely with the importance of establishing a moratorium, to not go any further down this path than we have at the moment, because I think there are just a host of very deep questions in this kind of Western kind of technological optimism that, if you're really born, in a Western country, people are almost born into this kind of optimism about, technology and progress and everything. I think it's time to say, okay, we're reaching a new level of this technological development, and we start talking about artificial intelligence. Do we really know what that means? What are the implications for an artificial intelligence? And after all, if that intelligence and the machines that produce it are human produced, aren't we likely to carry some human baggage in there, even unconsciously, that we're not thinking about, that are part and parcel of some of these problems I've tried to describe, the problems of thinking too instrumentally about what, quote, progress is. By instrumentally, I mean, we're always talking about the means to an end, and the end is always, human comfort, convenience and wealth. I mean, in many circles, that's the way they think of it. I'm just going to throw this out because I'm trying to write something about this right now, and so I'll just try this out. Maybe people who listen to this will reach out to me if they've got any thoughts. Here's something that I think no one has really explored. My dear friend and mentor and the biggest influence on my indigenous intellectual life was the late Vine Deloria Jr. And, Vine's indigenous metaphysics was simple. Power plus place equals metaphysics. But notice it was always about place. And place for him was tangible landscapes, seascapes on the earth. And here's what I've been thinking about. If the places we live, I'm back to technological homelessness in a sense. So let me make this connection. If people are spending so much time on their flat screen devices, laptops, phones, smartphones, iPads, isn't it possible that we become even more or less mindful of the physical world we inhabit? And we start thinking so much about these virtual places, these virtual spaces, that I begin to wonder, what does that mean to our spiritual existence? So I'll raise this in a very explicit reference. One of the piece that Vine wrote for the Native American Rights Fund in 1991, he goes through he kind of does a typology of sacred places and sacred lands, of, what makes a sacred land, saying, well, they're not all the same. Here's kind of level 1, level 2, level 3. He goes through 3 kind of categories of what he calls sacred lands. And then he has a 4th that I think people just kind of pass over. But I've been thinking about this a lot. And what he says is, but there's a 4th kind of sacred place. And he said sacred land. And that's one that has not yet been revealed. But we should be prepared to receive revelations for new sacred lands in new places. And this is the cornerstone of Deloria's kind of thinking about indigenous, if you will, religion or spiritual traditions. And I got to thinking about that. Can a virtual space create a revelation? Can a virtual space be a spiritual space? And what does that mean? How do we understand that if you're adopting a framework that places the earth, literally the tangible earth, the land, the air, the water, the plants, and the animals as the sources for revelation? Then what happens when people are no longer paying attention to those environments? Are we going to miss the opportunity for new revelations? Or maybe we're shed. And again, I'm problematizing this. I do not have the answer, but maybe some younger Native people start thinking about this. Can you imagine a revelation coming, a deep revelation for a people coming from a virtual internet space or web space? I don't know, but I think artificial intelligence makes me think about those kinds of questions.
Yeah, it's kind of all new territory, and it feels like we're just kind of starting to wrap our heads around it.
I think people are we're taking the first little baby steps, and I really do think this is a great topic for indigenous people to weigh in on, because I think, again, we need to be a part of the discussion. I'm inclined to think that yeah, artificial intelligence is just that, artificial, and what we need to refoster is some natural intelligence for humankind.
Yeah. Well, let me just conclude here with a final question, and this is kind of geared towards maybe some newer TCU leaders, faculty, students. In embracing native ways of knowing and indigenous knowledge, what advice can you offer TCU leaders, faculty, and students?
Yeah. So first of all, I say, look to your communities, look to your tribal nations within your tribal nations themselves, and maybe start really undertaking, some serious study and assessments. Language is a crucial part of this knowledge, and I'd be remiss if I didn't point that in. I think every tribal college, can do a lot to foster, teaching our indigenous languages as living languages and practical languages. And I don't know that I'm a complete Sapir-Whorfian, but there's this thing called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and that was a linguist and an anthropologist who argued, that ultimately languages are, the key to understanding culture and worldviews. And I think there's a lot to that. I mean, I think that is certainly true. I don't know if that's where it all resides, but so I think native language restoration, revitalization, strengthening, that is critical. That's something TCUs can do. I think starting to look at as you start looking at the literature, you can see that, what's happened just in the last decade. Major scientific organizations are welcoming indigenous thinkers into the fold, so to speak. And so I think making students aware of that, looking at the writing that is going on. And so, there are, Greg Cajete's been involved in this for a long time. Greg's work's a must read for people who want to look at native science. The work of course, Vine Deloria Jr., the work, of Robin Wall Kimmer or Kyle White. I don't know if he's got a book out yet, but he's doing a lot of work. So there are native thinkers, a lot of native thinkers that are starting to publish, to write, to try to inform and stimulate activities. So I think right now that's one of the key things that tribal college leaders, faculty, and students need to really be mindful of. And so that's something that we can do. And I know at Haskell, we're doing a lot of that. We're an intertribal nation, so our kind of landscape is very challenging because it's not just one tribal, culture or worldview. We have people from all over, what some people would refer to as Turtle Island, from all over. And yet we're trying to figure out ways, how do we include native ways of knowing, indigenous knowledges in everything we teach. And I think, hats off to my colleagues. A lot of them are doing some really creative things.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you for joining us today. It's been great talking with you as always. So thanks for taking the time.
Oh, you bet. Well, thanks for reaching out, Bradley. And we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but I do believe the TCUs can be leaders in this kind of work that we're talking about, and how we can center native ways of knowing and indigenous knowledges into the teaching and learning that we try to facilitate. And, it's not esoteric stuff. It's practical knowledge about how we might live better. And as I like to say, put ourselves in right relations with the balance of creation, the non human persons we share our lives with. So, thank you so much for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Great. And hopefully we'll see you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
Current Reflections is a production of Tribal College, Journal of American Indian Higher Education. Thank you for listening.
Now da trachin in slow and shame bashes chain, but Anita Shache Traban Dashanale. I am Marvin Tom, the subscription manager for the Tribal College Journal. Today, tribal colleges and universities are uplifting Native communities, and Tribal College Journal is their voice. So don't hesitate, subscribe to the Tribal College Journal today and help support American Indian higher education. For just $29, you will receive our quarterly publication plus the annual edition of TCJ Student, which features creative writing and art. It is as easy as a quick phone call or email. You can reach me at 970-764-4238 or at marvin@tribalcollegejournal.org. I look forward to hearing from you. Ahiha.